In 1983, the girl known as 11 opened the gates to the Upside Down. While this led to the temporary disappearance of Will Byers and the death of Barbara Holland, the most dangerous and impactful thing that opening the gate did was allow the Mind Flayer to access the human world. The Mind Flayer takes on an abstract form, often described as a shadow or a storm, even being referred to as the Shadow Monster. Like many characters from Stranger Things, it most likely exists as an allegory for the communist leadership that existed in Russia at the time, and we'll get into how its behavior reflects that. When the Mind Flayer enters the right side up world of Hawkins, it may be the biggest threat that the town has ever encountered.
We are talking about the destruction of our world as we know it.
To learn more about the Mind Flayer and its connection to the ideology of the Soviet Union, stick around to the end of this video. Welcome to Horror History. The Mind Flayer did not initially, or at least directly, affect the town of Hawkins, Indiana in 1983 when the gates of the Upside Down was first opened. However, roughly a year later, Will Byers sees the Mind Flayer for the first time, indicating its arrival to Hawkins. Like the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer's name originates from the manual of the boys' favorite game, Dungeons & Dragons. This shadow monster demonstrates many of the traits explained in the D&D manual, especially a tendency towards mind control and being linked to its victims. That all starts with Will, so to fully understand why the creature chose him as its first victim, I'm gonna have to take it all the way back to Will's first visit to the Upside Down. It is likely that Will Byers becomes the Mind Flayer's first target because Will was the first person to go into the Upside Down and come out alive. This means that the Mind Flayer could have already had some familiarity with him. I assume that it already started infecting Will in the Upside Down in November of 1983. When he's found, he has a tentacle suctioned to his mouth that they have to carefully remove. The tentacle is not attached to anything specific, it's just kind of part of the Upside Down. We've seen the Mind Flayer, or as I sometimes like to call it, the MF, take control of nearly every organism found in these tunnels, so it stands to reason that it was already making some sort of infection into Will. Over Christmas that year, Will coughs up a slug into his sink drain that later becomes a demodog. I did an episode of Horror History on the demodogs as well. Since the Mind Flayer is essentially the leader of the demodogs, this means that it was in fact the Mind Flayer that made contact with Will in 1983. On the night of October 28th, 1984, Will is enjoying playing at the arcade with his friends when he's suddenly given a vision that he's back in the Upside Down. It's here that Will actually sees the MF for the first time, partially obscured by a dark cloud filled with flashes of orange lightning. Even though the Mind Flayer hasn't technically flayed or taken over Will yet, its connection to him allows it to communicate its intentions without words.
What do you think the evil wanted?
To kill.
To kill you?
Not me. Everyone else.
However, Will is only a small part of the Mind Flayer's plan to infiltrate Hawkins. Justin Henderson discovers a new form of Demogorgon, which he coins as a demodog. The Mind Flayer's influence over these creatures and Will represents what's known as a hive mind, or collective consciousness. As a result, any information that Will or the demodogs learn, the Mind Flayer will know as well. This is an analogy to what went on in the USSR. In my episode on Alexei, I talked about how there was constant surveillance in the Soviet Union and its citizens were being monitored to make sure they were upholding communist ideals. In this same way, the Mind Flayer taps into the minds of those who it chooses to take control of and keeps them under constant surveillance, which goes a long way to helping it stay in power. The Mind Flayer makes the demodogs dig a tunnel system under Hawkins. The citizens are left completely unaware of the Mind Flayer's existence, apart from a few farmers who have land above the tunnel route, who notice their pumpkins rot and die, creating a lot of hostility between them. The Mind Flayer continues to reveal itself to Will, each time more vivid and more aggressive than the last. Will, an avid artist, draws what he sees in his visions, including a spider-like system of funnel clouds. Then, on Halloween, Will opens up to his best friend Mike Wheeler about what he's seeing.
It was like this huge shadow in the sky. Only it was alive. And it was coming for me.
The next day after school, Will is again sent into a vision of the Upside Down as the Mind Flayer chases after him, this time even more aggressively than before, resulting in this happening. Will later explains what happened to his mom and describes the Mind Flayer as more of a feeling.
I felt it everywhere. I still feel it.
The next day, he stays home from school and appears to be sick, but instead of running a fever, his temperature is extremely low. This is a major trait of the Mind Flayer, who likes the cold and wants to keep its human host as chilly as possible. This is probably another part of the allegory of the Mind Flayer being representative of the Soviet Union and Russia, and the greater region that the USSR had control over. The climate in that part of the world is absolutely freezing by my sunny SoCal standards, so it's very telling that the creature feels most at home when temperatures are low. no. Will very bluntly explains this when his mom tries to draw him a bath.
No. What? He likes it cold.
Much like citizens under the USSR, Will's individual personality is being stifled or hidden away under the Mind Flayer's own personality. Think of Will like a citizen serving under his communist leader. As Hopper and Mike come over to the Byers' house to help, Will does his best to convey what the MF is doing to him. He describes sharing the same thoughts and feelings, referring to them as his now memories. They feel like memories, but they take place in the present rather than the past.
It's like he's reaching into Hawkins more and more. And the more he spreads, the more connected to him I feel.
The Mind Flayer would soon face its first major threat when Chief Hopper digs his way into one of the veins of the underground tunnel system and catches a big surprise. When Hopper infiltrates the underground tunnels, one of the tentacled vines growing there sprays him causing him to collapse and become vulnerable. You know, I've used that clip before, but I don't think it's ever been more relevant. However, the Mind Flayer doesn't seek to flay Hopper the way that it's flayed Will. Instead, as Will promised, it just wants to kill him. As Will and the others work to save him, the Mind Flayer has another set of issues to contend with. Scientists at the Hawkins lab conduct a test with the soil that they collected from the areas with rotting pumpkins. They light a burner under the infected soil, causing a mini storm similar to the one that Will first saw the Mind Flayer in, but this time on a much smaller scale. This is another example of the MF reacting negatively to the heat, as MFs often do. At the exact same time, we see yet another example, when a group of soldiers burn off the tunnels with a flamethrower. Will's connection to the Mind Flayer causes him to writhe around in pain as well. There's probably no image in all of Stranger Things that's more disturbing. After Will is rushed to the Hawkins lab, he's sedated and the pain subsides. The Mind Flayer demonstrates that Will no longer has much agency when he barely recognizes the people that he knows. In other words, the Mind Flayer is almost completely in control. It makes Will tell the scientists that the only way to stop it is to send all of the soldiers to one specific place in the underground tunnels, but really it's just setting up a huge trap to get revenge on the soldiers that brought it so much pain with their flamethrowers. After this happens, Mike realizes that Will is essentially a spy for the Mind Flayer. The idea of a Russian spy posing as an American citizen gives us another real-world parallel. The KGB was a Soviet security and foreign intelligence agency in place between the 1950s and the 1990s, who controversially operated as a secret police unit in the Soviet Union. They also sent spies to integrate in other countries, like the United States, to get information on those who may oppose their communist ideologies. So if the flayed Will represents the KGB, then I guess Mike represents the American CIA, because he figures out that if they sedate Will, it'll keep the Mind Flayer from being able to spy on them. This is basically like unplugging the webcam. The Mind Flayer could no longer see into their lives. So the gang is able to escape the lab. Well, most of them. When Will comes to, he finds himself in another unfamiliar location. Because he does not know where he is, neither does the Mind Flayer. That is, until Will hears the Byers' phone ring and realizes he's close to home. Before the Mind Flayer can send any monsters their way, he's once again sedated and relocated. When Will, and effectively the Mind Flayer inside of him, wake up, they're being blasted with heat lamps. For the first time, Will's appearance changes, and his face and body are covered with blue veins, which kind of looks similar to what the underground tunnels look like. As Nancy jabs a hot fire poker into Will's side, because yes, Nancy is the type of girl to stab a 1,000-degree fire poker into her boyfriend's 13-year-old brother in a moment of panic, the Mind Flayer comes shooting out of Will faster than a Halloween retailer out of an empty storefront on November 1st. Right as this happens, Eleven and Hopper are in place at the Hawkins lab, and using all of her strength and being overpowered and stuff, Eleven closes the gates, cutting off the Mind Flayer's access to the right side up. The Demogorgons aren't able to survive without their host, but Will, now free of the Mind Flayer, is cool to see another day. But if we know anything about the actual personality of the Mind Flayer, it's that this MF has an appetite for revenge. First it was the flamethrower mercenaries, but now its sights would be set on Eleven for cutting off its access to the right side up. And it has every intention of making her pay when the gate is reopened in 1985. In the arms race of the 1980s, the Russians were competing with the Americans in many things, which included going to space and developing weapons. The part that wasn't recorded in the history books was that this arms race also included finding a way into this newly discovered realm that we know is the Upside Down. They too wanted to open the gate, but instead of using a middle school age Carrie White wannabe or Project MK Ultra, they went about it in the most Russian way possible, with a giant nuclear drill, which was hidden under the new Starcourt Mall. In late June, the Russians succeeded at opening the gates, advertently or inadvertently letting the Mind Flayer in once again, this time with a new plan and a desire to get back at Eleven. Instead of using Demogorgons, Demowogs, Demofrogs, Demohogs, or Demodogs for its demolition of all things democratical, it demonstrates its adaptability, realizing that it would be more effective to flay people and develop an army of human bodies as opposed to growing an army of its own. It uses the abandoned Brimborn Steelworks warehouse as its primary location, a decidedly more human-accessible safe house than the underground tunnels, which would make it easier to lure in human victims. It begins making its comeback by infecting an army of rats who congregate at the steelworks and explode after eating the wrong combination of hazardous materials. It's a whole thing. The sludge from their guts and tissues comes together and takes on a physical form of organic matter, which serves as the new physical body for the Mind Flayer. Remember, every time we've seen the Mind Flayer before this, it's just made up of these floating particles. So this is most likely the first time that it has a physical form. The Mind Flayer is no longer picky about who its first human victim needs to be. Literally just the first person to drive by will be just fine. Unfortunately for Billy Hargrove, his late night MILF call ends up being more of a facial penetration event, as he's dragged into the steelworks by the malevolent creature. Billy ends up with the same connection to the Mind Flayer that Will had a year prior, being able to think its thoughts and feel its feelings. It also communicates directly with him by presenting a dark version of himself that speaks to him. The Mind Flayer's impact on Billy is immediately noticeable. When Billy is out in the daytime, he's sweating profusely and almost looks sick. His skin even starts to burn when exposed to the sun too much. When Karen Wheeler tries to apologize for standing Billy up the night before, he sees a version of himself smashing her into a wall, probably as a result of the Mind Flayer being active. Instead of going through with this, Billy overrides the Mind Flayer and tells Karen to stay away from it. Probably for the better. As Billy tries to cool off in a cold shower, one of his co-lifeguards, Heather Holloway, checks in on him. She asks if he's okay, but what Billy hears is something different.
Take me to him.
But this time, Billy is unable to go against the Mind Flayer's wishes. Heather next comes to as she's being carried through the steelworks by Billy, who's under control of the Mind Flayer. He lays her down on the floor in an almost ceremonious way and whispers to her,
"Don't be afraid. It'll be over soon. Just stay very still."
She doesn't. As the Mind Flayer is flaying, it notices Eleven using her powers to spy on Billy and is able to vanish from her sight. Now, the Mind Flayer spreads to new victims from host to host, similar to a virus. This means that its spread is not dependent on Billy alone. An older woman in town, Doris Driscoll, notices that she has rats in her basement and that they're acting very strange, being aggressive and eating fertilizer. She believes them to be diseased, but eventually, just like the rats at Brimborn Steelworks, her rat explodes, allowing the Mind Flayer to materialize and infect her. As Mrs. Driscoll is driven towards the hospital, she reaches out for the steelworks as the ambulance passes by it, indicating that she wants to join the source of the Mind Flayer. We never see if the rats are responsible for infecting anyone else, but we do see flayed Billy and flayed Heather sitting down to dinner with Heather's parents, eventually knocking them out as well, taking them to Brimborn Steelworks and bestowing them the same fate. Once again, the flayed looks sweaty and awful. I mean, rough day at the office, dude? The Mind Flayer does its best to keep its human host cool to combat the summer heat. It certainly doesn't help when Billy is lured by Eleven and her friends into a sauna at the pool. They lock him in and crank up the heat in an effort to expel the Mind Flayer. As Billy writhes around in pain, the Mind Flayer's hive mind is still active, making Mrs. Driscoll have a similar but somewhat more hilarious reaction over at the hospital. So the Mind Flayer takes over Billy, making him smash his way through the door, which kinda makes me think that the Mind Flayer somehow makes him even stronger. Billy is a pretty strong dude who spends his free time pumping iron, but he literally bends and destroys a metal pipe. I mean, that's pretty impressive, but I guess we've seen stranger things. Billy's escape causes Eleven to have a throwdown against him, and while she is able to save her friends, the battle leaves her collapsed on the floor in tears. But as the Mind Flayer returns to Brimborn Steelworks, flayed Billy expresses to flayed Heather that this fight was just as hard on him.
The girl, was it her?
Yeah, it was her. She knows now. She knows about me. She could have killed me.
Yes, but not us. Not us.
Billy and Heather are more concerned about the collective whole of the Mind Flayer's influence rather than their own individual well-being. This sentiment is not that far off from the ideas promoted by Soviet Union propaganda. Red Army posters advertised slogans that perpetuated the idea that everyone together is better than the individual. The idea is also reflected in the manner in which the hive mind operates. The Mind Flayer can perceive the thoughts and feelings of any of the organisms it is flayed, but Will, Billy, and the other victims aren't necessarily given any information in return. Just like the KGB might encourage Russian citizens to report suspicions of anti-communist behavior while still keeping its main agenda a secret from the public. In the case of the Mind Flayer, it was building something big in the shadows as the 4th of July approached. In the meantime, more people start to see the creature's physical form. After Jonathan Byers and Nancy Wheeler fight off the flayed Hawkins Post newspaper employees, they break down into sludge just like the rats from the steelworks, and the material is added to the monster's body. Nancy tries to escape and lock herself in an empty room at the hospital, but the Mind Flayer's ability to turn itself into a gelatinous elementary school cafeteria food form allows it to leak through the cracks. But before she can be added to the ranks of the flayed, 11 shows up and air yeets that MF into the wall. It's actually one of the best air yeets I think we've seen. After then getting air yeeted out the window, I think the Mind Flayer realizes that it's no match for 11 when she's at full strength and retreats into a storm drain. Certainly not the first time I've analyzed a creature that utilizes a sewer system to terrorize a small town. Presumably, there are more unknown victims that become flayed. A news report at the end states that 30 people died in a fire at the Starcourt Mall, which is probably a government cover-up for what really went on there. I'm guessing these 30 people represent all of the victims of the Mind Flayer. They would include Doris, Billy, Heather, Heather's mom and dad, and Bruce from the Hawkins Post, which means there are probably 24 other victims throughout Hawkins. That also makes it clear what the Mind Flayer means when it repeatedly talks about building something. Like when 11 infiltrates Billy's mind to try to find the source of the corruption and accidentally pulls the Mind Flayer, or at least the flayed portion of Billy's brain, into her own headspace.
You let us in, and now you are going to have to let us stay. Don't you see? All this time we've been building it. We've been building it for you.
If this is the case, it shows that the Mind Flayer is kind of insane, and this whole thing was basically a revenge plot. Before this, I kind of assumed that this was like a world domination sort of thing, but no, the Mind Flayer is still pissed about 11 closing the gates. I guess the lesson to be learned here is don't go after someone else's dogs. That's not cool.
I have a feeling that really pissed him off.
As 11 escapes the grasp of the Mind Flayer within the world of her own mind, it had already summoned everyone that had been flayed, sending them to the Brimborn Steelworks, where they're broken down into the dark sludge material and absorbed into the stature of the Mind Flayer, which explains how it was able to grow from a roughly 7-foot tall monster at the hospital to basically a 16-foot big boy by Independence Day. And as with any good Independence Day celebration, there were about to be some fireworks.
Who here wants to see some fireworks? No!
While most of Hawkins was distracted and enamored by the colorful fireworks display at the 4th of July carnival, the Mind Flayer was busy making more moves in the shadows. Having used 11's own tactic against her by stepping into her mind, it now knew her location and was hungry for a rematch using its new, more powerful body. Another big showdown occurs, and although 11 is able to once again get the upper hand by dismembering 2 of the creature's orifices, it nearly captures her after dragging her by the ankle, and she's only able to escape thanks to Nancy, who shoots the Mind Flayer in the face! 11 wards off the creature by using what appears to be the full force of her powers to split its head in two, even if only temporarily. However, the bite on her leg leaves her in tremendous pain. The kids escape to the mall, where 11 passes out, and it's revealed that a slug, just like the one that Will copped up on Christmas in 1983, is moving around inside her leg. She's eventually able to excruciatingly remove it, but it seems that it may have accomplished its mission anyways, because after this, 11 loses her powers. At this point, we don't know with 100% certainty how this demawog left behind in her leg might have contributed to the hampering of her telekinesis, but let's look at what we do know. 11's powers have never been unlimited. The more telekinetic heavy lifting she does, the bigger the nosebleed she gets as a result. So we can conclude that her powers are somehow related to her circulatory system. When Will was infected, he became very sick and required many hospital and lab visits to recover. Seeing as how the slug was moving around inside of Elle, I'm guessing that it was able to infect her bloodstream, which may be the reason she's no longer able to call upon her telekinesis. Billy locates the kids at the mall and alerts the Mind Flayer to their location. It shows up and crashes through the glass ceiling above the food court, then, using its long arms, searches them all, probably looking for 11 or anyone else it can flay. Despite not being able to rely on 11's powers this time, the kids still manage to almost outsmart it by using a litany of sounds, including the engine of Jonathan's car, to lure it away from 11 and everyone else at the mall. But this ruse only goes so far, as Billy witnesses Max and Mike trying to help 11 out of the mall and summons the Mind Flayer back to her location. Without her telekinesis, Billy has a much easier time defeating 11 and brings her back to the food court, offering her to his master in an almost ceremonious way, as we've seen him do to others at the steelworks. He even gives the same warning.
Don't be afraid. It'll be over soon. Just try and stay very still.
But Elle's friends still have one last trick, and it is an explosive one. As we know, the Mind Flayer doesn't like heat, so the fireworks that Mike and Lucas stole from a grocery store earlier end up being an ideal weapon to fight back with. They engage in a huge battle, really dealing some major hits on the Mind Flayer in order to protect 11. Now throughout the video, I've explained many of the different ways that this monster represents the communist ideals of the USSR. So the fact that our American heroes use 4th of July fireworks, a literal image of USA patriotism and democracy, to fight the creature, is the perfect symbol for the 80s political subtext that has been running over and under the first 3 seasons of Stranger Things. But ultimately, these efforts are only enough to slow the Mind Flayer down. The final blow, so to speak, ironically comes from the monster's greatest servant, Billy Hargrove, who gets a little bit of control over his own body back after 11 enters his mind and reminds him of his childhood. Billy takes a stand against the Mind Flayer and sacrifices himself to protect his sister and her friends long enough for Joyce Byers to get to the gates to the Upside Down. Like the Russian scientist Alexei, who was executed for aiding his American friends earlier that day, the Mind Flayer no longer has any use for Billy, and he becomes a victim of its metaphorical capital punishment. However, he would be its final victim, as the closing of the gate causes the creature to immediately shut down and die. But while this was the end of the elementary school cafeteria lunch meat version of the MF, we would see the original shadow monster form looking over rural America again. That's right, I'm talking about Rocket League. In 2019, during a good old classic game of League, the farmstead was thrown into a perpetual state of upside down, and the Mind Flayer appeared for the first time in many years. It seems by now the Mind Flayer has pretty much forgotten about 11 and just looms over the farmstead and takes in some good old games of soccer. Now I know some of you are going to try to say that Rocket League isn't part of Stranger Things canon, but really I imagine Rocket League takes place so many years after 1985 that it would really be difficult to say that Mike, Lucas, Will, and Dustin do not eventually turn into these little egg characters. I mean look, you can see Chief Hopper right there. So I don't really see anything to suggest that Rocket League is not canon here. Not sure about Dead by Daylight though. If you want to see the histories of more Stranger Things characters, click that playlist on the left. And if you love horror, remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.